Simon Cowell, the sharp-tongued architect of modern talent shows, turned brutal honesty into both his weapon and his brand. Rising from the shadows of his father's music empire, he became one of entertainment's most powerful and polarizing figures. With a scowl that could shatter dreams and critiques like surgical strikes, he transformed television through Pop Idol, American Idol, The X Factor, and Britain's Got Talent, building a billion-dollar empire on the simple truth that most people can't sing. For decades, he reigned as the ultimate judge, feared and revered, the man who could launch or end careers with a few words. But behind that confidence and those designer t-shirts lies a story of childhood insecurity, heartbreak, a near-fatal accident, and the pressure of maintaining an image that never allowed weakness. And if Simon Cowell ever made you cringe, laugh, or dream, hit like as tribute to the man who proved cruelty and creation could coexist. It is heartbreaking to realize that the man who would become famous for crushing others' confidence entered this world already crushed by his own inadequacy. Simon Philip Cowell was born on October 7, 1959, in Lambeth, London, into a family where success was not just expected, but inherited like genetic code. His father, Eric Selig Philip Cowell, was a music industry executive and estate agent developer whose very presence commanded respect. A man who moved through rooms with the ease of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. His mother, Julie Brett, was a ballet dancer and socialite whose grace seemed effortless, whose beauty opened doors Simon could only watch swing shut. He had one older brother, Nicholas, and would later have 3 half-siblings. But it was Nicholas who became the mirror, reflecting everything Simon believed he lacked. The Cowell household in Elstree, Hertfordshire, was comfortable, prosperous, lined with the trappings of upper-middle-class British life. But comfort is not safety, and privilege does not inoculate against pain. Simon was a chubby child, awkward in his own skin, struggling with dyslexia that made school a daily humiliation. While other boys absorbed lessons effortlessly, Simon stared at pages where letters danced and refused to stay still, where reading aloud became public torture and every test confirmed what he already believed, that he was stupid, slow, fundamentally broken in ways that mattered. His brother Nicholas was everything Simon was not: academically gifted, physically confident, socially adept. Teachers praised Nicholas. Their father beamed with pride at Nicholas's achievements. And Simon learned early that love, even in families, is often conditional, measured in accomplishments rather than given freely. He became the disappointing son, the one whose report cards brought sighs instead of smiles, whose presence at family gatherings felt like an apology for not being someone else. The wound was not inflicted through cruelty, but through comparison, through the slow realization that in every room he entered, someone wished he was his brother instead. School was its own form of violence. Dover College, the independent boarding school his parents sent him to, became a prison where his differences were magnified under the microscope of adolescent cruelty. Boys mocked his weight, his struggles with reading, his inability to excel at sports or academics. He learned to hide, to make himself small, to survive by becoming invisible. But invisibility is its own kind of death. And somewhere in those lonely hallways, Simon made a vow that would shape everything. One day, the world would have no choice but to see him. And when it did, he would make sure no one ever made him feel small again. In 1979, at 20 years old, Simon Cowell stood at a crossroads that felt less like opportunity and more like surrender. He had dropped out of school at 16, unable to bear another day of academic humiliation, and spent the years since drifting through jobs that led nowhere. Runner on film sets, odd jobs that paid barely enough to survive. His father, Eric, watched his younger son floundering with a mixture of disappointment and resignation. finally offering Simon what felt like both lifeline and leash, a position in the mailroom at EMI Music Publishing, the company where Eric held significant influence. It should have been a gift, but Simon knew the truth. It was nepotism born from pity, a job given not because he had earned it, but because his father couldn't watch him fail anymore. The mailroom was humbling in ways school had never been. Simon sorted letters, delivered packages, made tea for executives who barely noticed his existence. He was 20 years old, watching people his age climb ladders, while he remained invisible in the basement of his father's industry. The shame was suffocating. Every delivery reminded him that he was there because of his surname, not his talent, that without his father's intervention, he would be nowhere. But in that humiliation, something unexpected began to form. Simon watched how the music business operated, absorbed how deals were made, studied which artists succeeded and which failed, learning the machinery of an industry that ran on instinct as much as talent. By his mid-20s, Simon had clawed his way from the mailroom to A&R positions, signing artists and producing records with EMI and later Fanfare Records. His eye for commercial appeal was sharp, instinctive, but his mouth was sharper. He developed a reputation for brutal honesty that made artists cry and executives uncomfortable. But the records he touched often succeeded. When others hesitated to speak truth, Simon wielded it like a scalpel, cutting through delusion to expose what would or wouldn't sell. It was not kindness, it was survival. The shield the fat dyslexic boy had built to ensure no one could hurt him the way school had. The breakthrough that should have validated everything collapsed instead. In the late 1980s, Simon launched his own label, E&S Music, with high hopes and borrowed confidence. But the venture failed spectacularly, leaving him bankrupt and crawling back to his parents' house at 30, sleeping in his childhood bedroom like a teenager. The ultimate humiliation for a man who had sworn he would prove the world wrong. The invisible boy had tried to be seen and failed, and the shame of that failure branded him deeper than any childhood wound ever could. The rise was slow, agonizing, built not on overnight success but on years of clawing back from humiliation. By the early 1990s, Simon Cowell had rejoined BMG as an A&R consultant, older and meaner than before, carrying the bitterness of bankruptcy like armor. He signed acts that others dismissed, novelty records, television tie-ins, projects the industry considered beneath serious consideration. Zig and Zag, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, Teletubbies. Simon didn't care if critics sneered. He cared that they sold millions, that each success was another brick in the wall between him and the mailroom, between him and the boy who had slept in his childhood bedroom at 30, broken and forgotten. By the mid-1990s, Simon had become one of the most commercially successful music executives in Britain, his instinct for what the masses would buy proving more valuable than any critic's approval. But commercial success was not enough. He remained invisible, a name on contracts but not a face the world recognized. His artists were famous. His bank account grew. Yet Simon was still the background player, still defined by others' achievements rather than his own. The hunger for something more gnawed at him relentlessly. Not just wealth, but recognition, validation, the kind of fame that would force everyone who had ever dismissed him to see his face and remember his name. The breakthrough arrived in 2001 with Pop Idol, a talent competition that seemed simple on paper, but revolutionary in execution. Simon was not just a judge. He was the antagonist, the brutal truth-teller in a world of polite lies. When contestants sang off-key, he told them they were dreadful. When dreams were unrealistic, he shattered them on live television. Viewers were shocked, then addicted. Finally, someone was saying what everyone thought but never spoke aloud. The show became a phenomenon, and Simon became the face of it. Not the host, not the winner, but the villain everyone tuned in to watch. American Idol followed in 2002, and suddenly Simon Cowell was not just famous in Britain, but globally recognized, his face plastered across American television, his insults quoted in offices and living rooms worldwide. At 43 years old, the invisible boy had finally forced the world to see him, not as his father's son or his brother's shadow, but as Simon Cowell, judge, mogul, the man whose honesty was cruel but undeniable. But even in triumph, the old wounds remained, whispering that the applause was temporary, that one day the world would remember he was still just the fat, dyslexic boy pretending to be someone who mattered. In 2008, at the height of his global dominance, the facade cracked in a way Simon Cowell never anticipated. He was 49 years old, commanding American Idol, launching the X Factor, building an empire that stretched across continents. Yet his personal life was collapsing under the weight of a pattern he couldn't break. For years, Simon had avoided commitment like it was a disease, cycling through relationships with models and celebrities that never lasted, never deepened, never asked him to be vulnerable in ways that terrified him. He had famously said he would never marry, never have children, that such conventional trappings were for ordinary people with ordinary ambitions. But behind the bravado lived something darker, a profound inability to connect, to trust, to let anyone see past the image he had constructed so carefully. Every relationship followed the same script: intense attraction, brief passion, then Simon's inevitable retreat when intimacy demanded more than surface performance. Women described him as emotionally unavailable, capable of charm but incapable of depth. A man who could give everything except the parts that mattered. The pattern wasn't cruelty. It was self-protection, the same shield the bullied boy had built decades earlier, now so thick that even Simon couldn't penetrate it to reach whatever remained beneath. The breaking point came through public humiliation rather than private realization. Terry Seymour, his girlfriend of 6 years, ended their relationship in 2008, citing his refusal to commit despite her patience and devotion. The tabloids feasted on the story, portraying Simon as the cold-hearted bachelor who chose empire over love. But what devastated him was not the headlines. It was the quiet moment when Terry looked at him with eyes that carried both love and resignation, and told him she couldn't keep waiting for a man who would never truly let her in. She had seen past the armor and found nothing there worth staying for. For Simon, the loss triggered something unexpected, not grief for Terry specifically, but the crushing realization that he was 49 years old, worth hundreds of millions, recognized worldwide, yet fundamentally alone in ways money couldn't fix and fame couldn't heal. The boy who had vowed to make the world see him had succeeded, but in becoming invincible, he had also become unreachable. At night, in mansions filled with everything success could buy, the silence was deafening. This wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the realization that he had built a fortress so impenetrable that even he couldn't escape it, and the cost of never being hurt again was never truly being loved. In the aftermath of his breakup with Terry Seymour, Simon Cowell faced a choice that would define the rest of his personal life. He could retreat further into the fortress he had built, or he could attempt something he had spent 50 years avoiding: genuine vulnerability. At first, he chose what he knew best: work. He threw himself into the X Factor and America's Got Talent with obsessive intensity, filling every hour with meetings, auditions, and productions that left no space for reflection. The empire expanded while the man contracted, becoming smaller inside the image that grew larger across screens worldwide. But recovery, when it finally began, came not through choice, but through accident, meeting Lauren Silverman in 2013. She was different from the models and actresses who had populated his past, married to one of his friends, which made her forbidden, complicated, dangerous in ways that paradoxically made her feel safer. When their affair became public and she became pregnant with his child, the scandal was explosive. Tabloids portrayed Simon as a homewrecker. His friend felt betrayed. The judgment was swift and merciless, but something unexpected happened. Simon didn't run. In 2014, at 54 years old, Simon held his son Eric, named after his late father, and felt something crack open inside the armor he had spent decades forging. The baby was vulnerable, entirely dependent, incapable of judgment or performance, and in that helplessness, Simon saw a mirror of everything he had buried. For the first time, he had created something that required not his wit or wealth, but his presence, his patience, his ability to show up when scared and exhausted and unsure. Fatherhood terrified him in ways business never had. Slowly, painfully, Simon began allowing Lauren to see past the image. The conversations were difficult, filled with years of practiced deflection, giving way to uncomfortable honesty. He admitted his fears of inadequacy, of being the disappointing son, of never being enough. She stayed anyway, not because of what he provided, but because of who he was beneath the performance. It was not the fairy tale romance his past relationships had pretended to be, but something more durable, a partnership built on truth rather than image. What emerged from the wreckage of 2008 was not the invincible mogul, but something more human. A man learning that strength without vulnerability is just another performance, that connection requires risk, and that the fortress that protected him from pain had also imprisoned him from love. Simon was finally attempting what had always seemed impossible, being seen not as the judge, but as the man. The 2010s belonged to Simon Cowell in a way few decades ever belonged to anyone. The X Factor dominated British and American television, creating superstars like One Direction, Fifth Harmony, and Leona Lewis from unknown hopefuls. America's Got Talent became the highest-rated summer program in the United States, with Simon joining as a judge in 2016 and transforming it into a global juggernaut. Britain's Got Talent discovered Susan Boyle, whose audition became one of the most-watched YouTube videos in history, proving Simon's instinct for viral moments and cultural impact. By the mid-2010s, his production company Psycho Entertainment was valued at hundreds of millions, his shows airing in over 150 countries, his face recognized on every continent. The money followed like a flood. At his peak, Simon was earning over $95 million annually from television salaries, production deals, and music royalties. He purchased mansions in Los Angeles, London, and Barbados, properties worth tens of millions each, equipped with every luxury wealth could provide. His car collection included Bugattis and Rolls-Royces. Private jets replaced commercial flights. The boy who had sorted mail in his father's building now commanded boardrooms where executives waited for his approval. To a generation, Simon Cowell was proof that ruthlessness could be profitable, that honesty, however brutal, was more valuable than kindness, that you could succeed by being hated as long as you were also feared. But success extracted its price in ways cameras never captured. The production schedule was relentless, juggling multiple shows across continents, flying between Los Angeles and London so frequently that jet lag became his permanent state. 16-hour days were standard, filled with auditions, production meetings, contract negotiations, and the constant pressure of maintaining ratings in an industry that devoured yesterday's hits without mercy. Sleep was negotiated in hours stolen between time zones. Meals were eaten in cars between appointments. The empire he had built demanded feeding, and Simon was both master and slave to its appetite. Relationships suffered under the weight of his schedule. Lauren and young Eric saw him in fragments, a few days here, a week there, always distracted by the next crisis demanding his attention. He promised presence but delivered absence dressed in expensive gifts and apologies. The pattern from his childhood was repeating. The successful father, too, consumed by empire to be fully present. The son learning that love is measured in material comfort rather than time. At night, alone in hotel rooms between continents, Simon felt the old emptiness returning, whispering that even with everything, he still had nothing that mattered when the camera stopped rolling and the audience went home. In 2013, Simon Cowell's personal life exploded into scandal that threatened everything he had built. At 54 years old, he had maintained his carefully constructed image as the eternal bachelor, the man too successful and too ruthless for conventional domesticity. But when news broke that he was having an affair with Lauren Silverman, the wife of his close friend Andrew Silverman, the tabloids erupted with a ferocity that even Simon couldn't control. The betrayal was public, messy, impossible to spin. His friend felt devastated. The media portrayed Simon as the villain in a story with no heroes, and for once, his brutal honesty couldn't deflect the judgment raining down on him. Lauren was 7 years younger, sophisticated, trapped in a marriage that had grown cold, but still legally bound when their affair began. The situation was complicated in ways Simon had always avoided. Real consequences, real hurt inflicted on someone who trusted him, real moral questions he couldn't dismiss with a cutting remark. When Lauren became pregnant with his child, the scandal intensified. Divorce proceedings began between Lauren and Andrew, ugly and public, with Simon's name dragged through every headline. The man who had built a career judging others now stood judged by millions, and the verdict was not kind. But what should have driven Simon away instead pulled him forward into territory he had never navigated: commitment. Lauren's pregnancy forced a reckoning with everything he had spent 54 years avoiding. He could run, as he always had, disappearing behind the fortress of work and wealth. Or he could stay and face the terrifying possibility of being a father, a partner, something more than the image he had performed for decades. The choice paralyzed him at first. Old patterns screaming to protect himself, to retreat, to choose safety over risk. The transition was brutal. Lauren's divorce finalized in 2013, freeing her legally but not emotionally from the wreckage. Simon attempted to build a life with her while tabloids documented every misstep, every awkward public appearance, every sign that he was failing at domesticity. Friends questioned whether he was capable of the transformation, whether the man who had never committed to anyone could suddenly become a father and partner. Even Simon questioned it, lying awake at night terrified that he would fail Lauren and their unborn child the way he had failed every woman who had believed in him before. What fractured in 2013 was not just his friendship with Andrew Silverman, but Simon's illusion that he could maintain emotional invincibility forever. The affair forced him into the light, exposed and vulnerable, proving that even the cruelest judge could be judged and found wanting. In 2012, the unthinkable happened. After 11 seasons of dominance, American Idol, the show that had made Simon Cowell a household name in America, began its slow, agonizing decline, and Simon wasn't even there to witness it. He had left the show in 2010 to focus on launching the X Factor USA, betting his reputation and millions of dollars on the assumption that his formula would translate seamlessly across formats. The confidence was absolute, the investment massive, the expectations crushing. But American audiences didn't embrace the X Factor the way Simon had predicted. Ratings were disappointing. Critics called it a pale imitation of Idol. The show limped through 3 seasons before Fox canceled it in 2013, a public failure that humiliated the man who had built a career on never being wrong. The collapse was not just professional, it was financial. Simon had invested tens of millions of his own money into the X Factor USA, convinced that his name alone would guarantee success. When the show failed, the losses were staggering, not enough to bankrupt him, but enough to wound his pride in ways money couldn't measure. The man who had mocked countless contestants for lacking talent now faced the industry's judgment that perhaps his instincts weren't infallible after all, that the magic that worked in Britain didn't necessarily translate, that even Simon Cowell could miscalculate spectacularly. The media turned on him with the same brutality he had once wielded against others. Headlines questioned whether Simon had lost his touch, whether the industry had moved past him, whether his brand of cruelty had grown stale in an era demanding different entertainment. Critics who had once feared his opinion now dismissed him as yesterday's villain, a relic from reality television's early days clinging to relevance as the landscape shifted beneath him. The schadenfreude was palpable. Everyone who had ever been humiliated by Simon Cowell now watched him stumble with barely concealed satisfaction. But what devastated Simon most was not the public failure or the financial loss. It was the private terror that perhaps they were right. At 54, he questioned whether his entire empire was built on timing rather than genius, whether he had simply been in the right place at the right moment and was now aging out of cultural relevance. The boy who had vowed to force the world to see him now faced the possibility that the world was looking away, bored, ready for the next judge, the next mogul, the next villain to hate. This wasn't just a canceled show, it was the beginning of obsolescence, and Simon discovered that no amount of wealth or past success could protect him from the industry's most brutal truth, that everyone eventually becomes replaceable. The body keeps score, and on August 8, 2020, Simon Cowell's body delivered a bill that nearly cost him everything. At 60 years old, testing a new electric bicycle in the courtyard of his Malibu mansion with Lauren and young Eric watching, Simon accelerated without fully understanding the machine's power. The bike surged forward, throwing him backward onto concrete with a force that shattered his spine in multiple places. The pain was immediate, blinding, unlike anything he had ever experienced. Lauren's screams pierced the air as Simon lay motionless, unable to move, terror flooding through him as he realized something was catastrophically wrong. The surgery lasted 6 hours. Doctors inserted a metal rod along his spine, fusing vertebrae, repairing damage that could have left him paralyzed, or worse. When Simon woke in the hospital, the agony was suffocating. But worse than the physical pain was the fear. Would he walk again? Would he ever stand upright without assistance? The man who had built an empire on projecting invincibility now lay broken in a hospital bed, dependent on nurses for the most basic functions, his body betraying the image he had spent 60 years constructing. Recovery was brutal and humbling. Physical therapy sessions pushed him to tears. Simple movements that had once required no thought now demanding agonizing effort. Walking down a hallway became a victory. Standing for more than minutes required breaks. The medications fogged his mind, and the dependence on painkillers terrified him. He watched others spiral into addiction from injuries less severe, and the fear that he might become one of them haunted every dose. Lauren became his caregiver, witnessing vulnerability Simon had never allowed anyone to see. The man behind the image reduced to someone who needed help bathing, dressing, moving. The accident forced Simon to confront mortality in ways wealth had always allowed him to avoid. At 60, lying in that hospital bed, he understood with brutal clarity that strength has limits, that control is an illusion, that the body eventually demands payment for every excess and every year of neglect. He had spent decades judging others, but the accident was life's judgment on him. That no amount of success protects you from fragility, that everyone eventually falls. And in that fall, Simon learned the hardest lesson, that the scariest battles are the ones where fighting harder makes no difference, where all you can do is surrender to healing and hope that the body forgives what the mind demanded of it for too long. In 2013, Simon Cowell faced a loss that would quietly reshape everything he thought he understood about himself. His father, Eric Philip Cowell, passed away at 81, and with him went the man whose approval Simon had spent his entire life chasing. Eric had been the measure against which Simon gauged every success, every failure, every decision. He was the music executive whose shadow Simon had lived in, the father whose disappointment had branded deeper than any critic's review, the ghost that haunted every boardroom where Simon tried to prove he was more than just Eric Cowell's disappointing son. Eric had watched Simon's rise from mailroom to mogul with a mixture of pride and something Simon could never quite name. Surprise, perhaps, that the chubby, dyslexic boy had managed to exceed expectations so drastically. They had grown closer in Eric's final years, the old wound softening into something that resembled peace, but never quite healing completely. There were conversations they had never finished, apologies Simon never offered, questions about whether his father had ever truly believed in him or simply been relieved that Simon hadn't failed as spectacularly as childhood had predicted. The funeral was attended by industry giants, but Simon sat alone with his grief, replaying every moment he had tried to impress a man whose approval always felt conditional. He thought about the mailroom job that had been pity disguised as opportunity, about sleeping in his childhood bedroom at 30 while his father watched with silent judgment, about every success he had achieved, wondering if it was finally enough to erase the disappointment of his youth. Now Eric was gone, and the question would remain forever unanswered. What devastated Simon most was the realization that he had spent 60 years building an empire to prove something to a man who would never witness its final form. Every brutal critique he delivered to contestants carried echoes of proving he could judge, because he himself had survived being judged and found wanting. Every success was a monument to the boy who had disappointing report cards. Every television show a louder argument against the silent verdict that he wasn't as good as his brother. But monuments built for the dead offer no comfort, and vindication that arrives too late tastes like ashes. In naming his son Eric, Simon had tried to honor his father while also attempting something different, breaking the cycle of conditional love, of achievements measured rather than presents celebrated. But grief taught him what success never could, that some wounds cannot be healed, some approvals can never be earned retroactively, and that the hardest part of losing a parent is realizing you're now carrying their judgment inside yourself forever. By 2020, Simon Cowell knew something had to change. At 61 years old, lying in a hospital bed with a shattered spine and a metal rod holding his body together, he faced a reckoning that success had allowed him to postpone for decades. The accident had stripped away every defense, every distraction, every excuse. For months he couldn't work, couldn't judge, couldn't perform the role that had defined him since his 20s. What remained was simply Simon, not the mogul, not the villain, just a man in pain trying to heal while his young son watched from the doorway, confused about why Daddy couldn't play anymore. The transformation began with honesty he had spent 60 years avoiding. Simon started speaking publicly about his vulnerabilities, the fear of paralysis, the humiliation of needing help with basic tasks, the terror that he might never fully recover. In interviews, he admitted that the accident had been a wake-up call about his lifestyle, about pushing his body beyond reasonable limits while ignoring every warning sign. He confessed that he had been arrogant, believing himself immune to consequences that afflicted ordinary people. The admissions were excruciating, each word dismantling the image of invincibility he had weaponized for so long. He redirected his energy toward what actually mattered. Family became the priority in ways it never had before. Simon reduced his workload dramatically, turning down projects that would have been automatic acceptances in previous years. He spent mornings with Eric, his son, present in ways his own father rarely had been, playing, listening, showing up for school events. With Lauren, he worked to build partnership rather than performance, allowing her to see not just the polished mogul, but the man still carrying childhood wounds, still terrified of inadequacy, still learning how to be loved without armor. The shows he returned to reflected a softer approach. On Britain's Got Talent and America's Got Talent, viewers noticed something different. Simon still offered critique, but the cruelty had been replaced with something that resembled mentorship. He praised more often, destroyed less frequently, as if nearly dying had taught him that words carry weight beyond entertainment value. Critics called it going soft. Simon called it growing up. What emerged from the wreckage of August 2020 was not the invincible judge, but something more valuable. A man brave enough to admit that toughness without compassion is just cruelty wearing a different name. That transformation requires confronting the parts of yourself you've spent a lifetime hiding, and that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you were wrong about almost everything. Today, at 65 years old, Simon Cowell lives a life dramatically different from the empire-obsessed mogul he once was. The sprawling Beverly Hills mansion remains his primary residence, but the frantic energy that once defined every moment has been replaced by something quieter, more intentional. He still works, producing Britain's Got Talent and America's Got Talent, overseeing Psycho Entertainment, but the schedule has transformed from relentless to manageable. The 16-hour days have given way to mornings with his son Eric, now 10 years old, afternoons spent in production meetings, and evenings reserved for family rather than business dinners with executives who only mattered on paper. With a net worth estimated between $600 and $650 million, financial security allows Simon the luxury his younger self never imagined. The freedom to choose purpose over profit, to turn down projects that would consume him, to prioritize health over hustle. His back requires ongoing management, daily exercises, and careful attention to posture and movement. The metal rod in his spine is a permanent reminder that invincibility was always illusion, that the body eventually demands respect, whether ego agrees or not. He's lost significant weight, transformed his diet, exercises regularly, not for vanity, but for survival, understanding that at 65, discipline is the difference between independence and decline. His relationship with Lauren Silverman has endured over a decade, though they remain unmarried despite the stability they've built together. She has been his partner through the accident, through transformation, through the slow dismantling of the fortress he spent 60 years constructing. With young Eric, Simon has attempted something he never witnessed in his own childhood: consistent presence, showing up for school events and soccer games, being the father who listens rather than the one who judges. The relationship is not perfect, but it is present, and for Simon, presence has become the measure of success that matters more than ratings or revenue. These days, Simon moves with the caution of someone who has learned that falls are permanent teachers. His critiques on television have softened without losing their edge, as if pain taught him that honesty and cruelty are not synonyms, that you can tell truth without destroying the person receiving it. When asked about regrets, he speaks with surprising candor. There are many, too many, but dwelling serves no one. The empire still stands, but the man who built it has finally learned that empires mean nothing if you're too broken to enjoy them, and that the only legacy worth leaving is measured in relationships rather than revenue. Few lives illustrate the cost of becoming invincible like Simon Cowell's 6-decade journey from insecure child to entertainment empire. Over 40 years in the industry, he has created television formats that aired in over 150 countries, launched careers for artists who have sold hundreds of millions of records, and fundamentally transformed how talent is discovered and packaged for mass consumption. The numbers are staggering. American Idol alone generated over $2.5 billion in revenue during his tenure. The X Factor created superstars across continents. Got Talent franchises became the world's most successful reality format. To multiple generations, Simon Cowell represents something larger than entertainment. He is proof that honesty, however brutal, can be monetized, that cruelty and creation can coexist, that you can succeed by being hated as long as you're also indispensable. He changed television by proving that judges could be more compelling than contestants, that conflict drove ratings more effectively than talent, that audiences craved honesty stripped of politeness. His influence extends beyond formats into modern culture itself. The acceptance of public humiliation as entertainment, the normalization of brutal feedback as keeping it real, the transformation of judgment into spectacle. Every singing competition, every reality show featuring harsh critique carries Simon's DNA. Young producers cite him as the blueprint for making conflict profitable. But history will debate whether his greatest contribution was democratizing talent discovery or normalizing cruelty as a business model. The failures, the accidents, the transformation, all of it adds necessary complexity to a legacy that could have been one-dimensional villainy. His professional setbacks reveal that instinct is not infallible, that even the sharpest judge can miscalculate spectacularly. His personal struggles expose the hollowness of building empire while neglecting the relationships that give life meaning. His near-fatal accident demonstrates that invincibility is always performance, that bodies break regardless of bank accounts. These failures don't diminish his achievements. They humanize them, proving that even the cruelest among us carry wounds that drive every decision, fears that fuel every critique. What survives time is not the insults, but the impact. The artists discovered, the formats created, the industry transformed. Audiences remember not just the cruelty, but the rare moments when Simon smiled, when approval from him meant something because it was earned rather than given freely. What endures is the image of a man who started invisible and forced the world to see him, not through talent or charm, but through sheer refusal to remain unnoticed. That Simon still stands at 65, humbled but unbroken, is its own paradox. His life proves that success without vulnerability creates isolation, that judgment without compassion leaves you alone with your empire. At 65, Simon Cowell carries the weight of a life built on judgment and nearly destroyed by refusing to be judged himself. From the invisible, dyslexic boy sorting mail in his father's building, to the mogul who transformed television and launched 1,000 careers, he has traveled roads paved with both brilliance and cruelty. The sharp tongue may have softened and the spine may carry metal, but what remains is a man finally learning that strength without vulnerability creates only loneliness, that empire without connection is just expensive isolation. His story reminds us that success built on others' pain eventually demands payment, that invincibility is performance that breaks under its own weight, and that transformation, real transformation, requires admitting you were wrong about almost everything. If Simon Cowell ever made you dream or cringe, what moment stays with you? Share your memories below. Leave a like as tribute to the man who proved that even the cruelest judge can learn mercy when life delivers its own verdict.